Hey, everybody, and welcome in to a mainly Broncos podcast and Play Like a Jet crossover. And it is fitting, Scott, because, obviously there was going to be one team that came out on top, whether it was going to be the Jets or whether it was going to be the Broncos. It came out in the Broncos' favor, right? It came out in the Broncos' favor, 37-28. But I will say, it's been kind of unfortunate because lately, to maybe use a phrase of your guys' podcast name, lately the Jets, they aren't exactly playing like a Jet right now. I mean, they aren't exactly playing like what we've really come to be accustomed to with the history of the Jets and everything. But real quick, as we before we jump into everything here in the podcast and everything that unfolded in the game on Thursday night, how are you doing, man?
I'm still recovering, to be honest with you, Cameron. I was up till 4 o'clock in the morning getting the podcast ready so that people would have it to download when they went into work in the morning, when they were driving to work. I'm still on like 2 hours of sleep, but I will say that was a much better game than I expected. I thought it was going to be some sort of like 14-10 type of thing. And I think I told you on the podcast when you came on Play Like a Jet that I felt like even whoever won this game should feel embarrassed because this is going to be ugly. But it turned out to be a much more entertaining football game. I am, like I said, tired, but overall, I'm just sort of numb right now because the Jets have been so bad for so long. And every time we think that maybe they're turning the corner, Sam Darnold is just, it's so frustrating, man. I can't tell you how hard it is to watch this guy who we all thought was going to be the dude who would turn everything around. And now he just looks completely lost out there. You saw it against Denver. He still has his fair share of moments, but overall, his footwork looked sloppy. He was missing throws. He has terrible field vision now. He's missing open receivers all the time. He takes sacks that he has no business taking. To be honest, it's like he never got over that New England game last year. And man, it's sad. So just to bring it back around to how I'm doing, I guess I'm tired, flustered, but in a way, I'm relieved that I don't have to get all worked up about these losses anymore because I've just kind of accepted that it is what it is, at least for this season.
And maybe for at least for the Jets' sake, it was at least a good Sam Darnold, that at least from what we saw on Thursday. I mean, there were still, it's kind of like what you mentioned, there were still a lot of things, a lot of spider webs, like a lot of things like cobwebs that Darnold still needs to work on and really kind of get cleaned out, like the footwork or, the turf monster coming back and kind of getting Sam Darnold a little bit. But just taking an unfortunate sack. But I tell you, from the Broncos side of things, it was very, I guess, a true depiction maybe of both sides, like of both teams, to see Sam Darnold run crazy for that 46-yard touchdown run and take the lead 10-7. So I think it was really kind of a true depiction, I think, currently of what both teams have been dealing with, for the Broncos' sake of just being just maybe that much closer, or just because for the Broncos' sake, like they're just been such a weird team to figure out, like are they really this close to contending? Are they still not there yet type of team? And it's always been that way, like ever since, Manning had left and everything. And it's really just been a quarterback away type deal from our vantage point. It seemed like it's just been like they've just always been a quarterback away. Right. And at least for the Broncos' sake and everything, I think from their psyche and from the defensive perspective, it felt like from the moment that Sam Darnold went on that 46-yard, I don't know how to describe it, scamper.
Right.
That everything changed defensively for the Broncos, and they were still giving up some decent chunks to guys like Jamison Crowder, and and we saw guys like Asang Bassi, who was an undrafted free agent. That was clearly a nice little matchup that Gase exploited there. Surprise, honestly, it just did not seem to be a consistent theme throughout the game, but it was also a nice adjustment too by Fangio and Ed Donatel to put Bosby in as a potential change there. But I think too we also saw lumps of where the Broncos were at quarterback still. Even though despite where we saw with Brett Rypien, he had a lot of flashes of being a capable quarterback in this league, but you can't make the type of throws and interceptions, that he did. And on the Jets side of things, I mean, it seemed right that they were pretty huge plays. And I don't know. It's just it was a very entertaining game, like you said.
Yeah, with Rypien, it's funny because, like you said, he obviously made those really bad throws. 2 of them to Pierre Desir. One of them was a pick six. And I got to be honest, Pierre Desir is absolutely horrendous. I know that he had those 2 interceptions, but he was getting crushed all game. Jerry Jeudy ripped the ball right out of his hands. He gave up, I think, something like 130 yards receiving, just terrible, despite the 2 interceptions. But still, to me, with Rypien, for a guy who is making his first start ever as an undrafted free agent from last year, and without the benefit of having that much time with the starters, like you said, he showed enough where even if you don't think he's going to be your long-term starter, maybe he could carve out some sort of niche in the league as a backup. You look at somebody like Nick Mullins in San Francisco, who also was undrafted out of Southern Miss, and he wasn't anybody that anybody thought was going to be a big deal. But remember, Jimmy G went down. He took over for the rest of the season, and he wasn't someone that San Francisco was going to build their team around. But they realized he could be a steady hand that could step in when needed if Jimmy G were to get hurt again. And that's exactly what's gone down. And actually, Mullins, I don't want to say he's 2-0 because technically Jimmy G did play half of that game against the Jets, but he was good enough to get San Francisco to 2 wins in the absence of Jimmy G for that one half against the Jets and then for the entire game against the Giants. So maybe Rypien showed you that he has the potential to be that type of quarterback. I don't know that he has the ability to be the franchise quarterback, but even if he can turn into a Nick Mullins, for an undrafted free agent, that's a pretty valuable commodity, and it gives you options to play around with. And I thought he did pretty well given the expectations. I think most people thought that the Broncos, like I said, were going to score very few points and it was going to be an ugly defensive battle, but the Broncos did way better offensively than any of us expected. And Philip Lindsay wasn't even in the game. So if you think about it, everybody thought they were going to lean so heavily on the run, but really they put a lot on Rypien's shoulders. And I thought, again, given what was expected of him, he did pretty well. Now, Darnold was the guy that you saw the flashes of elite level talent from. But overall, other than – now, listen, the interceptions are one thing. Those are things that can't happen. And if he consistently does that, Rypien's not going to be able to be the Nick Mullins type or anything like that. But for the rest of it, he had some nice throws. Nothing that wowed you or anything like that. But he did have some pretty nice throws. And Darnold was very erratic. And it was weird because – if you would have said before the game, one of these guys was an undrafted free agent and the other one was the 3rd overall pick in the draft, if I told you that and didn't tell you which was which, you might have been able to pick out Darnold just because of that run and some of these great, a couple of great throws on the run. But still, it's not like he played all that well in totality that you would have pinpointed him as the guy that the Jets pin their hopes to when they drafted him in 2018. So that being said, I mean, I thought Darnold certainly didn't live up to what you would have hoped, and Rypien, exceeded all expectations. And the rest of the game was interesting because the Broncos, who had a lot of trouble getting to the quarterback the first couple of weeks, really were crushing Darnold. And at one point, Mekhi Becton went into the game, and I said this on Twitter and later on my podcast, and this is the truth. And actually, by the way, it got retweeted by Mekhi Becton's mom. But I said, anybody who was involved with this decision to make Mekhi Becton active for this game when he clearly doesn't belong on the field should be fired, and I'm not even joking. I'm 100% serious. And that is how I feel. If he wasn't well enough to start, he shouldn't have been on the field, and then he came off holding the shoulder. So the Adam Gase disaster of mismanagement just continues. And man, what a weird game overall. But like you said, if you're somebody that didn't have an emotional attachment like me as a Jet fan or you as a Bronco fan, Cameron, if you were just a football fan watching a Thursday night game, you were expecting a terrible football game, and what you got was pretty entertaining stuff. Everybody was telling me that too. Like, I'm not a Jets fan, but boy, I really enjoyed that game. Sorry the Jets lost. They would always throw that in because it was an obligatory thing. But yeah, I mean, listen, 37-28, if you bet the over, boy, did you win big.
Yeah, and I do believe that had Rypien eliminated the interceptions, I think there's a decent chance that the Broncos probably would have won very handily, right? Because there was one point in the game where the Broncos they were up 27-16, and the Jets came back, took the lead 28-27, and then that's when the Broncos went down and got the field goal. I felt like had Rypien not made those disappointing decisions of turning the ball over, those are probably things that if you're going into next week, if you're Vic Fangio and that coaching staff, those are probably things you're going to strongly consider if you want to move toward Blake Bortles, or at this point, we got news that Drew Lock is 50-50. And obviously, with it being a franchise quarterback type discussion, it's probably going to teeter on the side of Drew Lock than it will be Brett Rypien. But I also kind of want to get your thoughts, because you also touched on something that kind of caught my eye at the beginning point of the game, or like a few hours before the game, or maybe even I believe it was an hour before the game, when they talked about Becton, right, and how he would be active for the game. That was very surprising to me, like, because the expectation was he was not going to play, and Troy Aikman and Joe Buck even talked about it. I mean, they had mentioned that, you know, at least around the point that if he was not really all that healthy to play, it was a little bit surprising that he was out there. Is that you touched a little bit on that? Is it really just a true product of what we had seen with Adam Gase?
Man, it's just, to me, completely unconscionable. I've still yet to hear an explanation that makes any sense. The idea supposedly was he was only going to play in an emergency. But again, that's fine if we're talking about somebody who's a marginal player. If your best, and let's be real about this, not just best offensive lineman, but at this point, probably their best offensive player, and dare I say, he might even be the best player on the team, period, as a rookie, which is both exciting in one sense because that means you've got a left tackle who could be really good, and frightening in another sense that a guy who's made 2 career starts at this point, or actually 2.5, I guess, technically, because the Colts game he left at halftime, that this guy could be your best player already. But to me, if he's not healthy enough to start, then it's ridiculous that there's any scenario in which he could find himself out on the field. And again, the fact that so many people who were connected to Becton, including his mom, were either commenting or amplifying the comments of other people about how it was malpractice for this kid to be playing, tells you all you need to know. You're 0-3. You don't want to be risking your potential franchise player in a situation like this. And look, I don't know exactly what's going on now. As of now, there hasn't been enough of an update as to his status. But for real, if he ended up hurting himself further to the point where maybe he would miss a significant stretch or miss the rest of the season, how on earth do you explain that to your bosses and to the fans and to the media? It's absurd. So when I saw him enter that game, I was infuriated because you have to protect a guy like that at all costs. And it just isn't worth risking him in a situation. Again, if he's not healthy enough to start, he's not healthy enough to play. That's just how it is. So, and look, the offensive line, you saw, the offensive line was terrible. I just mentioned how the Broncos, who had a lot of trouble getting the quarterbacks the first few weeks, just were killing Darnold. And a big part of that is because even the offensive linemen that came back weren't fully healthy, and they didn't play all that well anyway. But Chuma Edoga, who was in there for Mekhi Becton, was just awful. And then I think Connor McDermott came in, he's the one that should have come in anyway instead of Becton because of the situation. But yeah, the Becton thing was nuts. And again, it's another example of Adam Gase mismanaging things. There's been so many examples. I mean, you guys remember him from when he was at the Broncos, but he wasn't in a position where he was going to be able to really have any kind of negative impact because he wasn't the head coach, and he was basically the guy that held the clipboard for Peyton Manning, right? So it was very different when he was in Denver. Now he's got to manage the entire football team, and we saw what happened in Miami, what a mess that was. Only the Jets would have hired him after he got run out of Miami, and it's a lot of the same stuff. That Becton thing was just the latest. I mean, you go back last year, there were all kinds of problems. Kelechi Osemele sued the team because they tried to force him to play injured. You look at Quincy Enunwa, who is one of the locker room leaders for the Jets for the last couple of years. He had a letter posted in the locker room talking about how he was getting fined because he missed a therapy session, which it turned out he missed because his wife, who's a veteran, he was taking her out to lunch on her birthday or something. And so he ended up getting fined, and they publicly posted it and humiliated him in front of the locker room. The public spat, I don't want to say spats, but the comments about Le'Veon Bell, just the stuff that he said even about how if only these players would execute what he's drawing up, then they would have no problems, as if to say these players just aren't good enough for my genius scheme. There's so many other things that I could list, but he's just been such a mess on top of the fact that he's, let's be honest, played a major role in helping to ruin Sam Darnold's progress. So, yeah, I mean, I wish I could say I was surprised that Gase would pull a stupid stunt like that, but I'm not.
Yeah. And even if you're like an outskirt fan and like you have no rooting interest, is how much of it too is just that the Jets offensive line, I'm playing devil's advocate, obviously, but how much of it was just, that they looked at the offensive line as a whole, and the offensive line was desperate, and they rolled Mekhi Becton out there. I mean, I can understand probably say like that on the surface if you're like on the outskirts and like on a devil's advocate point of view. But man, when you are a head coach and you're losing the discipline of the team, I mean, I don't even know. And it's one of the things that had plagued Marvin Lewis for so many years,
Right.
like the discipline of the team. And I mean, it's only fitting, Scott, that we talk about the elephant in the room that happened all night long with the defensive coordinator and everything that unfolded with that. Obviously, the defensive coordinator comes with significant baggage, with it being the bounty gate and everything coming from the New Orleans Saints and everything that unfolded with the Broncos and the Jets last night, and especially the last minute or so of that game, to where, and it wasn't just the last minute; it was basically all throughout. Where, and I didn't do a true tally, but Scott, there was like 7 personal foul penalties, just something rather insane.
6 personal fouls, yeah.
Yeah, 6 personal fouls. Potential, to use that phrase, potential headhunting, maybe a Brett Rypien in the last minute or so as Shermer was just trying to wind out clock and roll clock around. offensive linemen potentially taking low shots on Bradley Chubb, as well as Noah Fant as well. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, on the Bradley Chubb and the Noah Fant thing, I mean, those are offensive players, not defensive players. But that was definitely something as far as a scenario that maybe made it even more entertaining.
Yeah, Gregg Williams, it's funny with him because last year everybody loved him because there were a variety of factors. First of all, the defense outperformed expectations and kept the Jets competitive in far more games than we would have expected. But also, it's because we all hated Adam Gase so much that it was like, well, Gregg is the real leader of the team and all that. But I think what a lot of people lost sight of is that the Jets defense last year was a little bit of a mirage. They were playing a lot of really bad teams. And so the Jets were able to do a lot better than most of us expected, even with the loss of one of their best players in C.J. Mosley, who was also, by the way, not playing this year. But I think this year everybody thought, or a lot of people did, I certainly did, that there was going to be a rude awakening, and we're already seeing it because the Jets are playing much better offenses, and the defense is – and to be fair, listen, they lost their best player. They traded Jamal Adams, so you knew that that was going to be a problem. But I don't think anybody thought the defense was going to be this bad. And I laughed because I tweeted this out too. At some point, ESPN said the Jets had the 17th ranked defense. And I was like, I don't know what the stats say, and I don't care, but there's no way the Jets defense is the 17th best. They're way worse than that because look at all the points they had given up, for example. But with Williams, look, there are people that try to defend that and say, oh, what do you think? Gregg Williams was telling his players to do this and that. One was a face mask. Another was, whatever, an accidental hit on the quarterback and so on and so forth, trying to excuse it. But the thing to me is, though, Cameron, if you have a unit and that unit is continuously getting penalized for, the personal fouls, at a certain point, you've got to pull these guys together if you're not the one telling them to do it, which, look, I don't know that he was, but certainly he gets zero benefit of the doubt for obvious reasons. But even if he wasn't, you've got to pull those guys together and be like, look, enough. No more of this. You're costing us the game. These personal fouls are just straight up killing us. And really, it felt like he was doing what he had done in the past, where out of frustration, maybe he was allowing for the chaos, but it was a disaster and it was gross. And then at the end, everybody was acting weird. First, Gase was calling these timeouts for apparently no reason. They were down two scores with a minute and a half left. There was no way the Jets were going to be able to do anything. The Broncos were trying to run out the clock, so Gase is taking timeouts. And then to retaliate, Fangio has Rypien throwing the ball, which is stupid on his part because even though Gase was being an idiot, Fangio is now putting his quarterback in a position to get hurt. And then you have Steve McClendon, of all people, who should know better. Steve McClendon, one of the most respected veterans in the league. He's been one of the most underrated players in the NFL for a really long time, one of the best run stuffers in the biz. He's a team leader. He's the one supposed to set an example. And he was the one that at the end of the game could have really hurt Brett Rypien. And so that whole chain of events was crazy where everybody involved acted terribly. And then I will give Fangio credit for one thing. He saw that it was potentially combustible, so he had his players not even engage at the end of the game. I think that was probably the smart move considering what had just gone on. But, man, that whole sequence at the end with Gregg Williams and Gase and Fangio, that was just ugly stuff, and you hate to see it. And quite frankly, Gregg Williams, last year, we didn't see as much of this, and also, like I said, because he wasn't Gase and because the defense outpaced expectations, people were okay with him and generally liked him. I think a lot of Jets fans have had enough now. His act has worn out. The players, listen, they can't tackle. They're getting called for nonstop penalties and personal fouls. They're making terrible mistakes. They just look awful all the way around. And so whereas people were willing to give Gregg Williams a lot of leeway last year, that is not going to happen this year. And already people are starting to say they've had enough of his antics. In fact, what I was getting a lot of last night was Gase should be fired and he could take Gregg Williams with him. So, yeah, I was really not happy with that at all. I thought it was indicative of Gregg Williams' reputation. And like I said, even if he wasn't telling these guys to go out and do that, it was incumbent upon him to rein them in and tell them to knock it off. And he clearly didn't do that. And if he did, certainly he's lost the defense because they weren't listening, which that's a whole other issue. So all in all, it was just an ugly night for that defense. Like I told you, Cameron, on Play Like a Jet, the biggest problem for the Jets right now is twofold. They can't score points and they can't stop anybody. Now, they did score points against the Broncos, but as you're well aware, the vast majority of those points were scored off of defensive plays, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not like the offense was lighting it up. And, man, that's just really it's a worst of all worlds, really, for the Jets. And they are – truthfully, we went into that game yesterday, I think, believing that perhaps the Jets and the Broncos were, if not the top two worst teams in the league, they were right in the discussion. I think what the Broncos showed you is that while they're not all that great, if Drew Lock comes back and plays at anything close to the level that he played at last year, they could at least be, maybe a bottom third, but not, one of the absolute worst teams in the league. They can at least be competitive. Mm-hmm. The Jets showed you that they may very well be the absolute worst team in the league. There's really no way around it.
Yeah, and I tell you, it was just one of those things it was just so frustrating to watch, and it was like what we talked about earlier, right? It was just like the Broncos, even though the Jets took the lead even early into the game, and then when the Broncos actually responded for that touchdown to take the lead back, obviously after the Sam Darnold touchdown, I believe after that point, it's just like the Broncos, the defense ended up becoming stifled, and it was funny how the 46-yard run was what started the Broncos defense to really play better, and maybe that was just again a stern talking to from Fangio, but I agree with you regarding everything that unfolded in the last handful of minutes when and really just the entirety of the game when. And if I'm being honest, when 3/4 of your penalties are roughing the passer or let alone personal foul penalties, at some point it's going to be raining not just solely on the defensive coordinator, but as well as the head coach. I thought that you put it so perfectly because, the head coach is like the president, right? The president, so to speak, of the football team that's on the field. Like he has to have control of that team on the field in every single moment. And Adam Gase, if he's clearly being, aloof, benign, or whatever, just aloof to everything that is going on a football field, you have to rein in on everything, whether it's players, whether it's coaches, and he didn't exactly do that. And maybe and obviously I'm not watching a lot of those Jets games every day. It's just one of those cases where just simple acts like that are where you can easily lose a football team. And so it's really frustrating when you see guys like Jamal Adams, really good players, go on and move elsewhere, and understandably the frustration maybe of a Jamal Adams. I mean, it's just those things that just can potentially be snowball effects, and to where it becomes to be a dumpster fire type situation with the football team. And for the Jets, I hate to phrase for you, Scott, like the what is next question. But I guess what is next for this Jets team?
Well, first of all, we're not entirely sure what's happening with this Darnold injury. Apparently he's got a sprained shoulder. They don't know exactly how much time he's going to miss, if any, but it does sound like he may miss some time. So if he does, get ready for your old friend Joe Flacco to take over for a little bit. He just came off of injury, and he was active for the first time against the Broncos yesterday. So that is really what's next from that standpoint. And then really, honestly, the rest of this season is going to be about seeing which guys the Jets are going to want to keep here beyond 2020, because honestly, anybody who isn't performing and isn't on a cheap rookie deal, the Jets are in a spot where you look at this, and this is the sad part. I was saying to somebody, how many guys that are on the Jets right now do you look at and say, 3 years from now, this person will definitely be on this team? And the only two guys that I can think of that I'm very confident will be here in 3 years are Mekhi Becton and Quinnen Williams. Williams, of course, the number 3 overall pick in 2019, and Becton, the Jets' number 11 overall pick here in 2020. Beyond that, nobody really knows, because this entire draft class is injured, right? It's crazy, right? The only player, they picked 9 guys in the draft. The only player that hasn't missed any time due to injury so far is the punter, Braden Mann. Everybody else is either hurt or has been hurt. LaMichael Pirine is the only one who's healthy from that group, and he just got back from injury. He missed the first 2 games because of injury. So I'm not saying that none of those guys can turn out to be keepers. You and I talked about Denzel Mims. I like Denzel Mims a lot. The problem is he had that hamstring injury in camp, which originally they were saying, oh, he's going to miss a few days and he'll be fine. Well, he's going to miss a few days and he'll be fine turned into he's not even eligible to come back until week 5, and who knows if he comes back at that point. And I'm having Devin Smith flashbacks, and that's not to say that I think that Mims is going to be a bust, but what I'm wondering is, at a certain point, are we going to find out that this kid is just not going to be able to contribute much in year number 1? And that doesn't mean he won't be a keeper overall, but that, again, points you to the fact that none of these guys seem like they're guaranteed to be here. I mean, even some of the guys that are veterans, Marcus May, who has had his moments here as the free safety, and now he's playing a lot of strong safety to make up for the loss of Jamal Adams, he's a free agent at the end of the year. Is he going to re-sign? Avery Williamson, their other inside linebacker besides C.J. Mosley, this is the last year of his deal. He's probably not going to be back. The rest of the offensive line is on glorified 1-year deals, except for your old friend Connor McGovern, who's basically on a glorified 2-year deal. But other than Becton, the rest of those guys are basically on 1-year auditions. You look at the receivers, all those guys are either releasable, or in the case of somebody like Rashad Perriman, who didn't even play yesterday, they're on 1-year deals. You look at the guys that are on the defensive side of the ball, the cornerbacks. I mean, I already said that I can't stand Pierre Desir, but he's on a 1-year deal, so who knows of him. Bless Austin, who has flashed a little bit. He's also looked lost at times, and there's no guarantees he's going to be here for the long haul. You look at Bradley McDougald, who they got in the Jamal Adams deal. He's a free agent at the end of the year. Is he coming back? Who knows? Henry Anderson on the defensive line, I would guarantee he's out of here at the end of this year. That was a horrendous contract that Mike Maccagnan agreed to, $10 million a year for a guy who's basically an okay defensive lineman. What an investment that was by Mike Maccagnan. And then you look at the rest of the defensive line, and you've got some guys that have shown some promise. Kyle Phillips, who was an undrafted free agent last year and played pretty well. Nathan Shepard, who was a 3rd-round pick a couple of years ago. These are guys that flashed at the end of last year, but there's no guarantees that these guys continue. And Steve McClendon, who I like and who's been a really good player, 3 years from now, the odds of him still being here are very low. He's already in his 30s. So you look at a team that only has 2 guys that you're pretty confident are going to be here in 3 years, and Mekhi Becton and Quinnen Williams. And I think, I hate to say this, but what's next for the Jets is to just get through this season and try to figure out what to do after that, because they've got a lot of draft picks now thanks to the Jamal Adams trade. What happens after that? Do they stick with Darnold? Do they try to go another route at quarterback? Maybe they do try to do something in the draft. I guess that depends on where they finish. But really, all this season is going to come down to is trying to figure out who is still going to be here past 2020. And that's really a sad spot to be in, because it feels like that's where the Jets have been so many times over the last decade, where it's wait till next year. We're starting the rebuild. This is like the 8th rebuild in 10 years, Cameron. So it starts to become fairly exhausting. So, yeah, I mean, technically what's next is they're playing the Arizona Cardinals. But in reality, what's next is you've got 12 games to try and figure out who's a keeper and who's going to move on at the end of the year.
And I think we all know by the end of the year, you guys will be looking for a new head coach. I think that I think that's it, we're getting to that point even after week 4. We're kind of getting to that foregone conclusion that you guys will be going to a new head coach, and obviously the Broncos know that all too well.
Right.
I mean, and at least lately, and that's been one of the biggest problems with the Broncos and just with the rotating of coaches, and no one wants to be the Cleveland Browns. I mean, no one wants to be the Cleveland Browns, to where you're rotating coaches year after year after year. And because if you're going through and you're trying to make a rebuild, that isn't exactly the best course of action. You want consistency, you want camaraderie, you want that type of staff that can be here and mold the type of players that want to be here, that mold the players that they know can fit the system and everything else. Those things take time, obviously, but you also want to make sure that, it is the right system that you're creating. And unfortunately, it's not been, sunsets and roses so far for the Jets, really.
Right.
But I think that it'll be interesting for even on the Broncos side of things. I don't foresee, regardless of what happens this year, I don't foresee the Broncos even parting ways with Fangio at any point. I mean, just because of, especially with how the defense is more than capable of playing under him. And really, it's just going to fall under where are the Broncos on that offensive side of the ball. They can put consistent 37 points, and even really 21 points on playoff contenders like the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think that that is something for them that they can hang their hat on, and that they can consistently put some sort of offense together with guys like Pat Shurmur. And one of the things too, before we go here, and one of the things, honestly, we didn't touch on a lot when we were on the podcast together previewing the game, the Pat Shurmur effect. I think that, maybe indirectly this game meant a lot to him, even though it wasn't the New York Giants per se. Pat Shurmur maybe felt that he wanted to show out not just the New York Jets or anything else, but more importantly, the New York media. That, hey, I can still do this in this league. I can still call a pretty darn good game. And yes, there were times where there were probably got a little bit conservative. I mean, let's be fair, because obviously with the Broncos up 27-16, you feel awfully comfortable at that point, right? And so for the Broncos' sake, you're feeling pretty good. But then you see Brett Rypien throw that interception. Then all of a sudden they get very, very, very conservative, start running the ball consistently, and they end up losing the lead. But overall, I thought that Pat Shurmur, and with him going back to New York, I thought was kind of a very nice side story and a very successful story, I will believe, for the Broncos.
Well, the interesting thing with Shurmur is that nobody's ever really questioned his ability as an offensive coordinator. It's just every time, the 2 times rather, that he's been elevated to head coach, he's looked in over his head. And you see that with a lot of guys. I mean, look at what's going on with Adam Gase right now, although I would argue that I'm not so sure he was that good of an offensive coordinator to begin with. But this, of course, is why it's a huge roll of the dice when you hire somebody who's a coordinator to be a head coach, because there's so much more to being a head coach and just being a coordinator. But yeah, I'm sure that Shurmur felt like being in prime time against the New York team, especially with Rypien, that if he could make this kid look pretty good and be competitive and maybe even win, on national television that it would help his stock a lot. I'm not even saying in terms of becoming a head coach again. I just mean, reputation wise. So yeah, I'm sure that was part of it. I thought he did pretty well overall. Look, you can't really get too crazy with Rypien, but I'll say he, like you said, he got conservative at times, but for the most part, he was much more aggressive than I was expecting, considering the fact that Rypien was starting this game. I think if it was Drew Lock, it would have been a different story, but I thought overall he did a pretty good job here, especially since the Jets, up until that last run at the very end, did a pretty good job stopping the Denver running attack. So, Shermer did a good job against the Jets. And look, unfortunately, it hasn't really been as much of a challenge as you would have hoped with this Jets defense to call a good game against them. I mean, look at the point totals they've given up: 37 against the Denver Broncos, 31 against the 49ers, and that's only because they took their foot off the gas, 36 points against the Indianapolis Colts, 27 against the Bills, and that's also only because they sort of took their foot off the gas. So if you look at the number of points the Jets are giving up on average, it's well over 30. So it just tells you that if you're aggressive against this team, it's going to pay off. And Shermer was smart. He realized that even though he had Rypien making his first start, that if he went at the Jets defense, he was going to be able to have success, and he did.
Yeah. Well, Scott, it was really awesome having you on and for a majority of the podcast, kind of getting a Jets perspective with this, because it's not often. And now, granted, we've recently just started up this podcast, but it's awesome when you can get a perspective of the other team that you faced. And I think that is one of the cool things of like a previous experience that I had over at Lockdown Broncos, doing those crossovers. And I believe we called them crossover Wednesdays. I believe that's what we called them. But no, this was fun, Scott, to have you on, talk about some New York Jets and talk about everything that really unfolded on Thursday night.
Yeah, man, listen, it was a blast, just like it was so much fun having you on Play Like a Jet. And I love doing crossover type episodes like this because for me, I like to keep current with everything that's going on with the league. I watch as much as I can. I watch the all 22s and then I watch as many games as I can. But obviously, somebody that watches every single game of a certain team and studies it intently is just by nature going to have a greater knowledge of that specific team than somebody who doesn't, because the reality is it's impossible to keep such close tabs on that many teams. So I've always found that this is fun. I mean, on Play Like a Jet, I always have on people the week of the game who cover the other team, because I think that it's important for my audience to understand what the Jets are up against from the perspective of somebody who really knows the ins and outs of what that team does well and doesn't do well. And so I do that once a week, and I think it's really beneficial for the audiences of both teams to do stuff like that. So yeah, man, it's a pleasure to come on with you, and hopefully we can do this more often if there's an opportunity to, like if a guy on the Jets goes to the Broncos or a guy on the Broncos goes to the Jets, or they make a trade or whatever else happens. I remember actually, Cameron, the first time we were supposed to do a podcast, it was a couple of years ago, when it looked like the Jets were going to sign Matt Paradis, and it fell through. So there was no reason to do a podcast, but I'm glad we finally got to do a couple of these. And like I said, I'm sure there'll be reasons to do them in the future, and I look forward to that.
And honestly, probably had we done a little bit more planning, we probably should have done a Connor McGovern episode as far as kind of like a what to expect type player with Connor McGovern, But it was a pleasure, and for our listeners over at the Mainly Broncos podcast, where can they follow you if they're Broncos fans and they feel so inclined to follow a New York Jet guy? Where can they follow you?
Well, if you want to see an adult human being slowly descend into madness, you can follow me on Twitter at PlayLikeAJet1, or you can listen to my podcast. I do 7 days a week of Jets. Honestly, I'm slowly starting to lose my mind, but that comes with the territory. Like I said, what we like to do is we do different shows each day. So it's a different angle that we're covering things from. So say usually the podcast goes up just after midnight each day. So right at the start of the calendar day, the podcast will be up for you. If you're a night owl, you can listen to it. If you work a graveyard shift, or even, if you wake up a few hours after that and you're driving into work, you can check it out then. Whenever it is, you can get it. And so what we do is on Monday, first thing Monday, the post-game report goes up, although this week obviously different because the Jets are playing on Thursday. Then on Tuesday, Brian Bassett, who I like to say is the godfather of Jets podcasts, he was really the first one to start podcasting Jets-only stuff. This would have been like 10, 15 years ago. He's back. I lured him out of podcast retirement, and he comes on and does a show every Tuesday called There's Always Next Year, where, as you can tell, that's been a theme with with the Jets for quite a while. And that's a fun show because they talk Jets, but then they throw in some other fun stuff. They're all big Golden Girls fans. So the last week they talked Jets, and then they did a Golden Girls episode fantasy draft, which was kind of funny. And then on Wednesdays, Manish Mehta, who's kind of a controversial character, but he's the beat reporter covering the Jets for the New York Daily News. He's known for breaking stories and ruffling feathers, I guess is the best way to put it. He comes on Wednesdays to give us a midweek look at what's going on with the Jets, all the news and all that. Thursdays, typically, Michael Nania of Jets X Factor comes on, and he's got a lot of cutting-edge analytics that he breaks down involving the Jets. And then Fridays typically is when we do Know Your Foe, which is like this, where somebody who covers the opposing team comes on and helps us learn about the team. And then Saturday we do X&O Quick Hits, which Joe Blewett from Jets X Factor does a phenomenal job breaking down the all 22s. He's got his own YouTube channel. This guy does like 4-hour shows every week, breaking down the film, and he's incredible at it. So he comes on and gives us like a condensed 30-minute overview of what went down in the Jets' previous game. And then Sunday we do the pregame report, mailbag, and also we do some gambling tips as well. It's a lot of fun. Chris Nimbley from JetsInsider.com comes on, and also Walter Cherepinski of Walter Football. He gives us the gambling tips so that even if you're not interested in that particular Jets game, maybe you want to win a few bucks. So you listen to that. And then I should also mention that the post-game report that I talked about on Mondays is with Andy Vasquez of NorthJersey.com, and typically also Charlie Campbell of WalterFootball.com will come on as well, and he will give us a draft report. So he'll tell us who helped and hurt their stock that weekend, which if you're a Jets fan and really even a Broncos fan this year, it's helpful information to have. In fact, this past week he gave us a little bit of a preview of some of the wide receivers who are raising their stock, which will be interesting for the Jets because they're going to need it. Certainly the Broncos have much better wide receiver corps. So that's what we do every week, at least during the season. And 7 days a week, 365 days a year, it's a grind. And like I said, if you follow me on Twitter at PlayLikeAJet1 or download Play Like a Jet anywhere where you can get podcasts, you will even if you're not a Jets fan, you will be able to witness the science experiment of a man slowly losing his mind. So if that appeals to you either way, check it out. And Cameron, like I said, a pleasure. I love talking to you, man. And I hope that we have an opportunity to do this again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope for the sake of those Jets wide receivers that you guys can do a huge facelift down there with all those Jets wide receivers. But unfortunately, we won't give you Jerry Jeudy or KJ Hamler or Cortland Sutton whenever he comes back healthy. But maybe you guys will luck out into getting Jamar Chase if you guys feel like you want to still give some confidence to Sam Darnold, I guess, going into 2021. But no, it was awesome really having you on. And for the mainly Broncos listeners, you guys can listen to us over on Spotify as well as iHeartRadio, iTunes, the Apple Podcast, and a bunch of other locations certainly that you guys can listen to this podcast as well. So thank you guys so much for listening to this mainly Broncos podcast crossover with Play Like a Jet.